everyone. Welcome. My name is Natalie Hernandez. I am the Associate Director of Climate Planning and Resilience at Climate Resolve, and we're really happy that you can join us today for this amazing panel that we have. So a little bit about the conversation that's going to happen today. It's important to realize that climate change can't happen without an action for it, without discussing those who it hurts most, marginalized communities. So in this panel, we're going to address how social inequality, systemic racism, and climate change are all inextricably linked. Right now, I'm going to introduce the different panelists that we have. First person that's going to come on the screen is Ami Rebel, who's the research director from Asian Pacific Environmental Network. Second is Christy, the founder and creator of Brown Girl Green. Then Julia Jackson, the founder of Grounded. And Sasha Taylor, a member of Black AF in STEM and an animal scientist. So with that, I'll kick off our panel and read our first question that we have. So the work that we're all involved in centers the voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of color populations, since those are the communities most affected by climate change. Since it was recently Indigenous Peoples Day, let's start the conversation there. I'll ask this to Julia, but how do you think Indigenous leadership, protection, and stewardship is important when it comes to addressing the climate crisis?
Thank you for the question. I think it's one of the most important solutions to addressing the climate crisis. And a really interesting statistic to consider is that scientists are saying in order to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius and to preserve a livable planet in the next decade, we have to protect 50% of the planet by 2030. And of that 50%, 37% of what we must protect in terms of biodiversity and bioregions are occupied by Indigenous communities. So they are stewarding major carbon sinks that sequester a lot of atmospheric carbon. The Amazon alone sequesters 5% of global greenhouse gases, and that's far more efficient than any carbon capturing technology. So we can't do this without Indigenous communities. We need their leadership, we need their knowledge, we need them to feel empowered to not just protect their territories, but also reclaim some of their territories. So I see them as really our unsung climate heroes. I'm going to be creating a council or supporting a council with an Atomi Toltec elder of 52 elders from around the world who will be stewarding the most biodiverse regions that we must protect. And so I'm really looking forward to learning more from their wisdom and knowledge.
Thank you so much for that answer, Julia, and appreciate all the work you're doing with Indigenous tribes. Now I'm going to kick it over to Ami. So the question for you is, you design, conduct, and supervise research and policy, and you support advocacy towards achieving environmental justice and renewable energy and climate resilience in California. That's awesome. So can you tell us a little bit more about your day-to-day at APEN?
Yes, absolutely. I'm happy to share more. And I think just to give a sense of who APEN is, we're a grassroots community-based organization, and we organize working class communities of color, particularly Asian American immigrant and refugee communities. And that's around a multitude of environmental justice issues to really be advancing our vision for healthy, thriving communities. And a fundamental part of our work is building community power and amplifying the voices of our members as decision makers and leaders. And so in the day-to-day, that looks like local organizing and leadership development and organizing community meetings with our immigrant and refugee communities we organize in the Bay Area. It looks like building political power through coalition building and electoral engagement, through a voter guide and phone banking with Asian American voters in California. And finally, we do policy advocacy, which is the work that I lead. And that looks like attending public hearings at agencies, writing and advocating for bills through the legislative process in California, in our capital in Sacramento, and just building relationships with coalition partners. So a lot of that's virtual now, but that deeply relational work and organizing continues.
Great, Ami, thank you so much for that. And I know you're in Northern California, and it's always nice when our work with Climate Resolve intersects as a part of like the Southern California efforts that we're doing. So now I am going to turn it over to Sasha. You're an animal scientist and a member of Black AF in STEM. Can you tell us more about the intersection and how did this come to be? And how does Black AF in STEM community empower you to grow? I think you need to unmute yourself, sorry. Would you, tech team, like me to move on to another question? Okay, we will do that. And while Sasha figures out how to resolve the tech issue. So I'm going to turn it over to Christy. Christy, your work is involving responsible consumerism. So let's talk about that. And I know you're also involved with the Intersectional Environmentalism Council. So can you please share more about what that is?
Yeah, so hi everyone, my name is Christy Drutman. I am the founder and host of Brown Girl Green, which is a podcast and media series, and something that I covered a few weeks back ago in partnership with the Rainforest Alliance was talking about responsible consumerism. And I think that most of the time we talk about systemic issues and the importance of addressing the systems that are producing the environmental harms that, you know, are harming our communities, harming our planet. But I think in some ways that narrative, if used too much, removes the power that the individual person and consumer has to demand that companies can actually make a change. And I think that consumers are starting to become more educated about the environmental harms that companies are causing. And I think more companies are realizing that they have a brand reputation on the line. And especially when, you know, companies are on social media, on these online platforms, we as young people specifically have the power and the platforms to call them out and to demand that they do better, whether it be their packaging, whether it be where they source their materials or their ingredients. We're able to actually, you know, tackle their supply chain through public call outs. And I think I really try to bring that aspect into the work that I do, to also be able to provide options to people that feel more accessible and tangible to them. And Intersectional Environmentalist is a platform that is led and run by a diverse group of, you know, content creators, activists, visionaries who really wanted to come together and create a platform that specifically talked about intersectional identities in relationship to environmental work. And again, this is about redefining what it means to be an environmentalist by incorporating intersectional identities and experiences into that work. And an important part of that, at least from my position on the council and others, is thinking about the content we're creating, the companies we're working with, and the policies and work that we're supporting. So yeah, I would check out Intersectional Environmentalist to learn more about what we do. I just released a community resource page for the Southeast Asian community, so you all can check that out. But yeah, there's all different cultures and intersectional identities that we're going to keep building out to keep redefining and opening up that space for more people.
Thanks, Christy. And I think folks are dropping the links into the chat about intersectional environmentalism in the council, as well as the work that you're doing on Instagram with Brown Girl Green. So with that, I'm going to go back to Sasha. And again, we can hear you. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about AF in STEM. Black AF in STEM.
Yeah, so to answer the full question, I have to kind of go back. When I was growing up, I didn't think I could be an animal scientist or work with animals in general because I never saw anybody that looked like me. So when I graduated high school, I was like, you know what, forget it. I'm going to actually go after this dream because that's my passion. After years of working with animals, and I weirdly enough, found a community of people via Twitter. They reached out to me and was like, do you want to join a little group chat that we have? And I found a bunch of people that look like me, that love nature, love going outside, love camping, all this wonderful stuff. And eventually we started a movement together as a community, to show that Black and brown people are in STEM. We Black and brown women are in the sciences and in mathematics and in technology and engineering. And so now I, as a Black queer woman, can now show people that are younger than me that you can do whatever you want to do, no matter what it is. That I am the role model now that I needed when I was a kid. And this organization is allowing me to do that, and I'm so very grateful for it.
Thank you, Sasha. It is really nice to come into a space, and I think a phase in your life, right, when you remember what it was like to, I guess, look up to others who were doing this work. And I'm sure all of us on this panel have experienced that at some point. And I think we really are doing this panel to kind of inspire and encourage others to come on board, because there's enough room for everybody to be involved in climate change solutions. So I'm going to turn it back over to Julia. You're the founder of Grounded. You told us a little bit about your work with Indigenous tribes, but Grounded holds the mission to identify and advance scalable climate crisis solutions to ensure a thriving planet. So when it comes to the Earth and the multitude of problems, where immediately do you think attention needs to be drawn towards now, and why?
First, I will say voting, and I don't want to elaborate too much on that. I think it's pretty self-explanatory, getting leaders that really unite behind the science. I think immediately what needs attention is that we have a decade to really turn this crisis around. And there are so many solutions to turn around the climate crisis. There isn't one silver bullet technology being invented in a lab. We have all the solutions to make a difference. What I think needs attention is the fact that beyond phasing out of the fossil fuel industry and doing our part to reduce CO2 and other very potent global greenhouse gases, we absolutely must start drawing down atmospheric carbon. And we can do that by implementing practices that increase biodiversity, regenerative agriculture, conserving biodiversity in biodiverse regions. There's many through photosynthesis with trees. Even mushrooms play a part in sequestering atmospheric carbon. Our oceans have sequestered about 40% of our global greenhouse gases since the beginning of the industrial era, and our oceans are basically done sequestering our carbon. They've been working really hard for us, so we need to do our part and support these vital bioregions and regenerate them if we want to actually make a difference and not exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius. So I would say the urgency around not just converting and divesting from the fossil fuel industry, but also drawing down atmospheric carbon. And there's a great book everyone should read called Drawdown, and it shows 100 solutions to reverse the climate crisis.
Thank you for that recommendation, Julia. I am going to now expand on what you said about voting. And we vote for great elected officials who then create bills. And one of the bills that's in the legislature right now is the Environmental Justice for All Act. So this bill is created by the people for the people. It creates community-driven solutions that protect public health, prevent the destruction of the environment, and give communities real power against polluting corporations. But many are asking themselves, why should I care about the Environmental Justice Act, or for All Act? So I'm going to open this up to Christy and Ami to answer, and ask Christy if you could kick us off.
Yeah, so the Environmental Justice for All Act is this really awesome piece of legislation that pretty much gained a lot of traction this year to actually proceed forward. It was actually co-written by environmental justice leaders along with people in Congress and the Department of Natural Resources. And basically the goal of the bill is to create a pool of money of $76 million in grants to go to environmental justice organizations and advocacy groups who are really fighting on the front lines for environmental justice. It also strengthens their right to fight against these polluting companies that may be, if they have a factory or some sort of polluting facility nearby their neighborhood, they'd actually, be able to have a stronger fight in that because a lot of the language in there strengthens and legitimizes that fight for disproportionate burdens that are placed on low-income communities and Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities who are disproportionately exposed to toxic chemicals and toxic pollutants in their air, water, and soil. So this bill would essentially be like a really amazing precedent to start building off of how we can create more institutional support for those community organizers on the ground. So yeah, that's the Environmental Justice for All Act.
And that, I think, is a great segue, I think, to be uplifting, right? Community organizers. APEN is one of those community-based grassroots institution that I think this type of policy really uplifts and allows us to build momentum and do the work that we're doing. And I do want to name, right, with roots in the civil rights movement, environmental justice is really born out of the struggle against environmental racism, in which people of color and working class communities are the ones living close by and most affected by the health burdens of fossil fuels and climate pollution. And so just to give some granularity on that, what we mean when we say environmental justice, APEN organizes in the Bay Area in California, and in Richmond, where we organize Southeast Asian refugee communities. Our communities are living on the fence line of the Chevron refinery, one of the biggest polluters in the state of California. And an explosion there in 2012 sent thousands of community residents to the hospital for chest pains, for shortness of breath, sore throats, and headaches. We also work in Oakland, Chinatown with Chinese immigrant communities. Our community members describe Oakland as a walk for pollution because we're living close to the port, and residents are exposed to harmful diesel pollution, which is contributing to the city's high asthma rates. And so policies like the Environmental Justice for All Act really are centering our communities, particularly those that are on the front lines of the climate crisis, those who have been historically overburdened by the extractive economy and will be most impacted by future disasters. And so those types of policies are fundamental to fight for if we're looking to really uplift folks that are most impacted by the climate crisis.
Thank you so much, Ami. And these issues that we're talking about are really systemic. Years of racism that we're trying to undo in the climate movement. And Sasha, we talk about this term called redlining, which is also part of systemic racism. And we want to know, how can we change the term redlining to greenlining? So for those who don't know what redlining is, in the United States and Canada, redlining has been the systemic denial of various services by federal government agencies, local governments, as well as private sector, to either directly or selectively raise prices. Neighborhoods with a high proportion of minority residents are more likely to be redlined than other neighborhoods. And with that, I'll just let you answer the question, Sasha. How can we change the term redlining to greenlining?
Well, it's the fact that so many of these areas have been hit hard for years, and now they're getting hit even harder with climate change. Trying to do this requires so much work in policy and in community, and to see these communities as what they are, communities, and not just numbers and figures. One way we can do that is just a simple thing, increasing the living wage so these people can live correctly. And then we can also introduce educational systems that improve and teach these people how to better themselves, and try not to whitewash or gentrify these areas in the process, which is a hard thing, a hard concept for a lot of people to get. It's like, how can you not, move a Starbucks into an area without improving it? But you can. You can do all of that and keep the homes that are there and improve on them without increasing the rent or making it where people that are on government assistance can't live in them.
Thank you, Sasha. And so continuing on this topic about systemic racism, which is a thread through all the questions, actually, we're talking about neighborhood changing, and sometimes that's associated with climate gentrification, or folks that are moving, in order to get away from different impacts of climate change, like wildfires or sea level rise, even extreme heat, trying to move to a cooler area. So I'm going to ask Christy, so basically as the climate changes, communities change, right? And who controls these changes?
Yeah, so just to explain climate gentrification, you all could actually check out the Brown Girl Green website. We wrote a blog all about this, but you can see it in cities like Miami right now, where a city or an area that's typically being threatened by climate change through things like sea level rise, we'll see that a lot of the community that probably made up that area, like predominantly Latinx, who are like local to that area, will tend to be stuck in the lower lying areas, while people who have more wealth and come from higher socioeconomic backgrounds will probably relocate, move higher into the hills away from, floods or rising sea levels. And then at the same time, like basically these, folks who are on the ground, who have been there for a long time and actually made up, a lot of the culture and a lot of, the roots of that space, will be forced to relocate, might even be forced to just stay in their homes, but then we'll see their properties decrease. And it's just tragic. It destroys, the local economy. Some of their businesses might have to shut down. And we're just going to inevitably see the landscape continue to change, while people who have more economic and political power to be able to outlive some of the major climate impacts will survive, while communities who don't have the resources or the institutional support or the socioeconomic background to sustain themselves with an emergency fund, for example, are going to be forced to deal with the worst impacts of those crises.
Thanks, Christy. And we'll have to check out your Instagram for some more information on that topic. Julia, going to ask you a question. So I feel a lot of people are too afraid to tackle the climate crisis. It seems too large of a problem. And you said that you believe in the power of humans and have the belief that we as humans have the capacity to not only sustain, but regenerate the earth. How can people take action individually and collectively now, especially the communities that are being hurt the most? And maybe you can tell us a little bit about your new digital climate academy.
Okay. I actually founded Grounded after experiencing the climate crisis firsthand, and I lost my home to the Kincaid fire. So it's almost a year since I lost my home. And so the climate crisis is right here and right now in my community in Sonoma, California. We're experiencing unprecedented, not even mega fires, now they're calling them, I think, gigafires, that are generating their own fire tornadoes called firenadoes. So the urgency of this crisis, it's not something we're going to be experiencing in 10, even 20 years. It's right here, right now. And people sometimes forget that the House of Commons and the state of New York declared climate emergencies about 2 years ago. And what's the follow-up with stating that we're in a climate emergency? I don't blame people for really feeling overwhelmed, but somehow since losing my home, I remain more optimistic because I believe in human ingenuity, and I've seen so many climate solutionists. A statistic that really is mind-boggling to me is that less than 2% of all philanthropic giving goes to the environment. And of that, 0.2% of those funds actually make it to communities on the ground. So 0.2% of all philanthropic giving globally is making it to solutionists on the ground and frontline communities that are actually able to turn around the climate crisis. So we have to massively change funding, not just within the private and public sectors, but also individuals can make a difference. I think individuals on an individual level, you can vote, you can wear clothes that are either vintage or more sustainable because the fashion industry actually contributes to 10% of global greenhouse gases. An individual can also reduce their food waste. And then also switch your bank because a lot of banks actually support the speeding up the climate crisis. And then on a systemic level, there's many things people can do too, but I don't want to go too long. Our Climate Academy that we're launching in January through the organization I founded, Grounded, is going to showcase solutionists because we all know the problem exists and is real. Yesterday or 2 days ago on Climate Underground, they were saying that the pace at which the climate crisis is occurring is equivalent to 600,000 Hiroshima bombs per day. And so that's astronomical amount of heating that's occurring, and it's just speeding up. But we can turn this around through implementing drawdown solutions. And what we're going to do on the Grounded, you can check us out at grounded.org, Climate Academy, which will launch in January, is showcase the solutionists who are on the ground, also some technologies, but really just feature solutionists that need more funding. They need to scale quickly. And so we'll just be a community of solutionists. I've seen so many of them and their work, and that's what keeps me optimistic even after losing my home.
Thank you, Julia, and I'm glad. I think they're going to share some of the information about Grounded possibly in the chat so people can learn more. I'm going to jump right in and ask Ami about this new report that her organization, APEN, helped publish. I actually printed this one out. This is the Resilience Before Disaster report. So Ami, can you tell us more about your community resilience work and how you are raising the public visibility of the needs of friendly communities within statewide climate adaptation efforts?
Sure. And yeah, I appreciate, Julia, you sharing your deeply personal story. I think it uplifts, right, the ways that California is living the climate crisis, and we're experiencing the impacts across the state. I know many folks are tuning in from California, and it's evident that our state is being pushed to extremes, and the record heat, fires, and pollution all have one thing in common. They were made worse by climate change. And this convergence is the strongest signal yet that the climate crisis isn't far off from the future. It is here today, more intense than ever. And scientists are saying we've lost complete control and that there isn't a normal anymore. And that when you add these crises together, the impact is cumulative. But for environmental justice communities plagued with the burden of our polluting industries for generations, there is nothing new about cumulative health burdens. But what we're seeing is that traditional models of crisis response are deeply inadequate. They're coordinated through militarized entities like sheriff's departments. They rely upon protocols like evacuating to faraway sites. They share alerts in maybe 1 to 2 languages. And they require people to present identification to access services. And so these types of policies are collectively shutting out many people from the support that they need. And I know that picture is grim, but there are new possibilities in this moment. And that's what our report is aiming to uplift. Because through historic disinvestment and deep systemic failures, our communities have had to be incredibly resilient. And now they're organizing for change, and they're innovative local models of crisis response. In some places, we're seeing neighbors form mutual aid networks to share resources. We're seeing schools providing food to families, and public libraries are being turned into cooling and air respite centers. And so in the short term, those are some of the examples of what it can look like to address the harms and protect communities to cope and respond to the climate crisis. But I want to sort of end and reinforce the point that in the long term, it is fundamentally about building power and addressing systemic inequalities that are oppressing working class communities of color. And that's where fighting and holding corporations accountable, our extractive industry like the Chevron refinery is incredibly important, and where the fundamental change really comes from, in addition to sort of these short-term responses.
Sami, and what I do like about the way you framed resilience before disaster and the work that you do is, communities are working together before fires are happening or before we have heat waves. And I think some of the work that we're doing at Climate Resolve is complementing that too. We're trying to create what we call like resilience hubs in Los Angeles that are pretty much like community centers that have their own power grid that could be used in terms of times of disaster, but also as a place where people go to get workforce development, connections, and can just access, I think, more resources throughout the year rather than it be like the cooling center that pops up during a heat wave. So anyways, I'm looking forward more to the work on resilience in California, and really exciting what you're doing. So the last question I have is about voting, right? And, how can we, the people, help to fight for climate and social justice at the same time? Please add any final statement you'd like to share, at least for this part of the Q&A, as we think about the November ballot. Yeah, who wants to go first? Sorry, raise your hand.
No, you go
Oh, no.
Go first. I'll follow your lead. I'll go after you.
You sure?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, one of the things that we all need to take into consideration is going for the environment, going for the only place that we can call home. That is what a lot of people need to remember and take into consideration. There's only one place that we all call home, and there's only one place where all our stuff is, and it's this planet. Voting for the planet should always be your number one goal, because voting for the planet equals voting for making sure everything is safe and everyone is safe.
Yeah, I'll go next. I just wanted to say that I think just moving forward, I really recommend people actually know who their representatives are at all levels of government. There's a lot of resources online where you can actually look up who your representatives are, the bills they support. And I think especially with learning about the Environmental Justice for All Act, we're going to need a lot more people supporting that bill. There's going to be other bills to protect oceans, rivers, forests, etc. So just keeping up with the news, the mainstream media is really bad at reporting and covering climate news. So make sure you diversify your social media feeds, educate yourself as consistently as possible on the latest information and journals coming out about the climate crisis, and especially stories coming from frontline communities. So that's what I'd recommend for everyone moving forward to stay engaged.
A question came in for me, I believe, and it says, how do banks play a role in climate change, and what banks do you all suggest? So a lot of banks are heavily invested in extracting in the Arctic or deforesting the Amazon, and the fossil fuel industry. And the fossil fuel industry has been so detrimental to a livable planet. I'd say that of the banks out there, Amalgamated Bank is the one that's completely divested from fossil fuels. Bank of the West actually has a really strong divestment plan, but a lot of other banks really need to be pressured, actually, because we actually, as citizens, through our credit cards and our purchases, are supporting the climate crisis by banking with some of these extractive banks. So those are the two banks I'd suggest switching to. I don't know if anyone else has other banks they'd recommend too.
I would recommend credit unions as well as a sort of alternative to sort of banking with larger institutions that have investments in extractive industries. And I did want to, as we move into the Q&A, reinforce, given the time that we're in right now, right, 2 weeks away from the election, that climate justice is absolutely on the ballot this November. And since many folks are living in California that are tuning in, I do want to make a plug for a priority campaign you can support right now with your vote, which is yes on Proposition 15. For too long, giant corporations like Chevron have been polluting the air we breathe and corrupting our politics, all while benefiting from a tax loophole that is defunding $12 billion worth of public resources and services that are desperately needed for our communities. So, we're really fighting hard for Prop 15 to close that loophole and generate $12 billion for our schools, our health clinics, and libraries and parks. And as part of the EJ movement, we're up against some of the state's biggest corporations. And so we need folks' support to win these resources for our communities. And with this, the state on fire, with the climate crisis around us, we really need to be funding community-led solutions instead of subsidizing big oil. So just want to reinforce that message. It's worth fighting for and supporting community-based organizations like ours that are fighting for this vision at the grassroots level. So just leaving folks with a plug on for folks in California, how they can support.
Yes, Ami. So yes on 15, Proposition 15 for the California ballot.
Next, quickly say this election too is voting for our survival as a species, and that only 2 countries are on track to meet their Paris Agreement 1.5 degrees Celsius commitments, and those countries are Morocco and Gambia. And the US is actually in the worst category. We're heading towards 4 degrees Celsius right now as a country. I think there's 3 other countries that share the worst category with us of the 5 different categories. And by voting, we can really up our commitments, and we should be taking a leadership stance on re-entering the Paris Agreement, so that other countries can also step up and reach 1.5, because countries look at us and see that we've withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, and they're like, well, why do we have to step up? The US isn't stepping up. So by voting, you're actually voting for the globe, and essentially to reach science-based targets.
Thanks, Jillian. I'm going to reframe a question that came in from an attendee named Josh. So Josh is asking about, well, the question is here, but the panel previously spoke on voting and how literacy tests are a way of targeted voter suppression. how is that affecting us at an even larger scale? And if the panel can just maybe talk about voter suppression and like what we think about with climate change and like how people have been oppressed in the past with systemic racism and pollution burdens and environmental decisions, how is voter suppression like coupling all of that too? Sasha, you want to go?
Yeah. I currently live and I'm from Mississippi. Voter suppression here is a thing, and it is still a thing. From you have to have a voter ID along with an actual state issued ID or driver's license, to they will not allow you to vote early unless it's under very, very, very strict consideration. You also can't vote a certain amount of time out from the election. It's bad. It hurts so many communities. It hurts everyone. It hurts the entire state. It hurts the entire country, because though that is, you're not allowing everyone to have their voice. You're not allowing everyone to be a part of where we all live. And it's just not fair and it's not right. And this is where it goes to the people that can vote. If you're able to help go out in communities and do transports, like driving people to voting areas. If you are a teacher or anything, consider moving tests or quizzes or anything like that to an entirely different date, so people don't have to stress about going out to vote and then coming to take a test or something like that. It's small things that we can do right now to help everyone be a part of this country equally.
Appreciate that, Sasha. Does anyone else want to jump in?
I would just say that specifically right through this COVID-19 pandemic, where our voting processes have been upended, and voting safely is such a risk right now, to be able to go to your ballot center to vote by mail. And so the set of conditions we're living at are making it very challenging. And we're having to do targeted outreach to make sure folks have a voting plan, to make sure that they're registering to vote by mail, know where their polling centers are, that there's volunteers and poll workers there to make sure folks can vote safely. And so there's a lot that we're having to do to protect folks. And I do want to uplift, specifically for monolingual, right, immigrant and refugee folks, making sure that they have resources and information in language as well is so critical, because those are the strategies when information's only in English to keep folks locked out of our democratic processes and limit their engagement. So just some other layers and conditions that we're fighting against, and the importance of grassroots engagement to make sure folks have plans and are getting their votes out.
Thank you, Ami. Another question has come into the chat from someone named Sally, who asked what people or groups are struggling the most when it comes to climate change and social inequality. And I'll just also highlight some answers that I think already the panel has said. Ami was talking about communities that primarily don't speak English as a first language sometimes have a barrier to accessing information. We talked about communities that are minority populations affected by redlining. And I think we also talked about indigenous tribal areas that have had land taken from them in the past. So I want to ask the panelists if there are other groups you think of when who are struggling the most when it comes to climate change and social inequality.
Yeah, I wanted to speak on that. So at least in countries like the Philippines and Brazil, those are some of the most deadly countries in the world right now for environmental land defenders. So that's typically indigenous land defenders on the ground. And a lot of the indigenous land defenders who live in these countries are being threatened either by the government or by, troops that come in or companies that do mining for different minerals on the ground on indigenous lands. And tribal leaders will stand up for their people and for their land, especially in the Philippines, and they'll be killed. And similar with environmental journalists, people who live in the global south who are trying to report the environmental injustices and crimes that are happening worldwide. The term is called ecocide. People fighting against that in other countries are being killed for it. So I just wanted to highlight that. And also climate refugees. So people from around the world that come from, communities that are going to continue to be plagued by climate change in the Middle East and Asia, in the Pacific Islands and so forth. They're going to migrate and be forced to migrate to, land masses that are high and dry. And that's going to lead to a lot of issues with immigration and border control and just, denying people human rights. So I just wanted to highlight those two groups as well as what's at stake and what continues to be at stake.
Another group that's always going to be impacted are the disabled and the elderly. Like I said, for those that can help, you should. It depends on the disability and all those things, but there are ways to help those. There are resources out there. If you have the free time, find them so you can help those that you can help.
I think another group I'd like to speak for, they often don't have a voice, are all of the species that we're losing to extinction and how vital biodiversity and these species are. For instance, otters are declining, and they're responsible for eating purple urchins that then feed on kelp forests. And without kelp forests, we can't actually draw down carbon from the atmosphere. So we're in this in a huge mass extinction at the moment, and that's another group I just thought I'd add in there. And we really do need animals and biodiversity as a species. We aren't the most important species. We think we are.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, that we're deeply connected. So our sort of like our human civilizations and communities and neighborhoods are deeply interdependent, right, to our natural systems and the plants and ecosystems that we rely on as well. I think that's right. I want to point folks on that question to another report that APEN worked on called Mapping Resilience that highlights a lot of the stories from California of the communities most impacted. So we highlight our unhoused populations. Homeless folks in particular are so impacted by climate change and the climate crisis. We talk about incarcerated firefighters who are on the front lines, agricultural workers who are bringing us food every day, right, to through the COVID-19 pandemic and wildfire smoke, as well as our rural communities, who I often think APEN organized in urban areas are often also not uplifted as being on the front lines. So just to name on others that when we say frontline community, those are the folks and communities we're really uplifting.
Thank you, Ami. And we are going to move on to our final question. Can the panelists speak more on climate matters that are on the ticket this coming election? What should we be looking for? And I'm really pondering this too, because in California, there's just so many propositions. And you could say that social justice is a part of all of them. There's different things from increasing voting rights to not having as I would say like harsh penalties on some of the offenses that imprison people. And so there's I think a lot of ties to climate justice just being really social justice and wanting to improve humanity overall. but want to know like what other folks are thinking about when they think about climate matters on the ticket.
I would just say that I think to your point, Natalie, it's right that like climate justice is racial justice, is criminal justice, is worker justice, and those are all things that are on the ballot. And I won't go as specifically because we're limited in terms of what per se I can really name, but doing your research and looking at voter guides in terms of what progressive organizations are uplifting, and thinking about this, I think in the spirit of intersectional environmentalism, as fighting for our incarcerated community folks, fighting for labor rights and workers. These are all part of our vision for climate justice when we're doing this work. And so seeing that intersect means that every issue, I'd say in terms of propositions at least, or local fights, is really connected to this deeper vision for social justice. And I will say that so much of change happens locally and regionally. And so obviously the federal election is on a lot of folks' minds, and there's a lot of impact there. And at the state level, and when you look at sort of local races in your own community, in your own districts, there's a lot of opportunity for change in the neighborhoods you're living in.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that even if you live in a predominantly blue or red state, like don't let that influence whether or not you choose to vote in this election. You should be voting based on also considering, like what was just said, like on local, regional level, because those representatives at all levels of government have certain budgets that are going to implement certain solutions. And I know that some people are, not feeling great about voting this year, but I think it's important to emphasize that it's not just about the federal election, that we need people really politically informed at all levels moving forward, even beyond this election.
Thanks, Christy. And I think I am going to close this out. Want to thank our panelists, and my takeaways from this conversation is that we do need to think a little bit more broadly about climate change and integrating processes to undo systemic racism, think about intersectionality, think about consumerism, think about housing policies, think about lingual access to the information that we're putting out there. There's so many great solutions that have been highlighted during this panel. I want to encourage people to follow some of the organizations that these amazing women represent. And again, that's Black AF in STEM, Brown Girl Green, the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, or APEN, and then Grounded. You can check all of those organizations out.
What's up, guys? Boye from The Future Party, and from the future, clearly. Thank you so much for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. Like, subscribe, and click the bell for more notifications. Check out the description for more on us. We've got some amazing things for you coming down the pipeline. Peace.